Welcome back to the What Happens Next podcast. Hope you're having a lovely week so far and you are in for a doozy. Is that a word? I think it is. Doozy of an interview this week. And we've got double benefit because we've got the insights of both Peter Hyson and Hilary Rowland. Peter and Hilary specialise in helping people navigate personal change, discover purpose, and manage transitions in life, particularly in that area we talk about what happens next, which conventionally might be called retirement, but actually can be whatever you want it to be. In the interview, Peter shares a lot about his diverse path and how he's managed transition and change in his life, and why now his portfolio career has enabled him to better help other people. We have a really deep dive conversation into navigating identity after retirement and how some of those labels that we give ourselves, particularly when we're thinking about what happens next, aren't particularly helpful. We look at Ikigai or Ikigai, I don't know how exactly said, the Japanese philosophy of finding meaning and purpose in life, and why understanding that can give us a real insight into what happens next. And we talk about the benefits of rewriting our own personal stories. I hope you find a lot of value in this interview. Without further ado, let me share. We're on a mission with What Happens Next to help as many people as we can navigate the next chapter of their life. So I need a favour. I'd like you to visit our YouTube channel at What Happens Next Life, and we'll make sure we put a link to the YouTube channel in the comments. Enjoy the videos, like the ones that you get benefit from, but most importantly, please subscribe. We want to help as many people as we can with What Happens Next, and subscribing to our YouTube channel for free is the easiest way you can help us. I'm really excited this morning to be joined by Peter and Hilary. Morning, Peter and Hilary. How are you?
Extremely well, thank you.
Morning, Chris.
Good.
Enjoying the amazing blue sky with some really spectacular clouds.
Yeah, how's the temperature where you are? Because it's a little bit nippy where we are.
Yeah. Nippy is a good word.
With true British understatement, I've known it warmer.
Yeah, I like that. But as you say, as long as the skies are blue and it feels a bit fresh, it's normally okay. And we're recording this at the start of Jan. How was your New Year and festive period?
Very nice, thank you. Very, very good. Yeah.
Good. Love it.
Caught up with family, caught up with friends, not too busy. It was really good. Thank you.
Love it. Great stuff. So we're here to talk about purpose, and we're here to talk about navigating what's next in our lives. But before we do that, and for those of our audience who don't know your story, tell us a little bit about both of you.
Okay, so I've worked for a couple of big companies like the BBC and PwC, where I was a director, but most of my career has been spent working with senior people, so either leadership development or organization change, and most recently as an executive coach. Yeah. So two sides of our business now. We run retreats for senior executives who may be just needing, they're just, run down, run out of steam, need a little bit of recharging, or actually are stressed and burnt out, or have come to some kind of crossroads in their lives whereby they just need to take some time out to think about what's next. Yeah. You've invited the right people on here, Chris. There are two sides of the business, as I say, retreats and executive coaching.
And how much of that organisational change element, Hilary, applies to individuals as well? How much of
that? Huge. Very much the same principles apply. Right. Yeah. You've got to plan change. You've got to have it organised. Just simply thinking that it's going to happen by itself, or because you issue a list of instructions, it isn't going to work.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's good.
I claim to be something of an expert in change, Chris, since I've had at the last count about 7 different career changes.
Whereas Hilary's got the experience helping people, Peter, and has gone through change herself. You've gone through quite a lot, right?
If you want the official answer, Hilary's the one who sticks with things. I'm the one who gets bored and fed up and moves on. I kind of range from...
should we use the polite British term and call it a portfolio career?
Absolutely. That's exactly what I would say.
So tell us a little bit about what were some of those roles throughout your career?
I've done my first professional career was as a teacher, but I've also been a professional swimming coach. I've worked in local radio, including in Essex.
Yeah.
I have seen Southend at 5:30 on a Sunday morning. Does life get grander than that? I'm a Church of England vicar. I run businesses, and now I'm a writer of cosy murder mysteries.
Which I've read. I've read your first. I was on a cruise last year when I read your first one, and it was a really good accompaniment to my to my looking out at the Norwegian fields. So it was
yes.
It was good. So we're here to talk about change, and we're here to talk about how people navigate what's next. And I had a really interesting conversation yesterday, funny enough, that didn't go out live, but is going to be part of the resources on www.whathappensnext.life, about how difficult change is at times, particularly when we're so used to the status quo. And it reminded me of a client that I'm doing some work with at the minute to help with their financial plan and make sure that they've got clarity that they can afford to do what they want to do. And even though they can, their identity is wrapped up in the MD of a large construction business. That's what they see themselves as.
Exactly.
So I suppose the question I want to ask first, and apologies, I did send you some plan questions, but this comes to mind more sort of clearly. What do we need to do about that identity challenge first?
That's a really, really good question, Chris, because I think it's very easy. If somebody says to you, well, who are you? It's very easy to say, well, I'm a business owner, I'm a business leader, I'm a father, I'm a mother, all of those things. Actually, those aren't what we are. They are. There's something much deeper, which is about who we are. Not easy to find, not easy to put a finger on there.
Yeah. And where do we start with that? If we're thinking about how to put our finger on that, if we're identifying, if the stories we tell ourselves are, I'm the MD of a construction business or the MD of a financial planning business, how do we then start to sort of think about that re-navigation?
I think that's coming back to that sense of purpose that the whole thing around today. It worries me when sometimes I meet people and they introduce themselves as a retired MD. Now, granted, I have a thing about not retiring anyway, but I think if you're defining yourself in terms of something you've been in the past, we need to do a bit more thinking. We need to do a bit more exploring of who I am now and who's the real me. My favourite quote, and Chris, we've shared this, I think, before, is one from Christopher Wendell Holmes. Oliver Wendell Holmes, which is, most people die with their best music unplayed.
Yeah.
And what drives me currently to help people find what that music is and to then share it, because there's frustration if we're not sharing ourselves at our best and who we really are, but there's also a loss to the rest of us. And I do believe we're put on this world for a purpose.
Yeah.
It is about genuinely discovering that purpose and sharing it with others.
Yeah, I mean, a retired job title effectively is a really interesting way to describe yourself, isn't it? Because it's saying that's what I used to be, but I've not redefined myself in terms of where I'm going forward.
Exactly, and I think that people can get very stuck in a particular identity. So if you've always been successful, and then for some reason or other stop being successful, it's kind of, well, okay, well, what am I? What's going on now?
Mhm.
Equally, as a business leader or an owner, you may have had some failure, and it's very easy to get stuck in that as well. I'm a failure. I don't want to try anything else because it may go wrong. So, as I say, I think it's a question about really going underneath all of that, all those labels.
Yeah, I really like that. I think you're right. Peter, help me understand. You said something interesting there, and we will go back to the actual questions that I prepared for at some point. But
we've known you long enough.
Yeah. Well, look, the challenge with my curiosity, Peter, is that you say something that I'll just want to untie. And actually, I'm with you on the concept of retirement. As I'm writing the What Happens Next book, and the more I think about this arbitrary concept of X age, we do this, it feels more of a concept of the industrial age than the modern one. But what's your challenge with the concept of retirement?
Oh, well, I think it's pretty much what you've said already. My parents are of a generation where my father retired at 65 and was dead by 72.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, I've seen too many people who have defined themselves by their role in their working life, sometimes encouraged by the questions that we ask them. Who are you? What do you do? And when that ends, they think, right, I'm going to put my feet up. I'm going to enjoy sitting in front of the fire. I'm going to have my slippers there and, the pet dog at the side. And when we've lived busy lives, when we've lived stressful lives, when we've lived hard lives, if we suddenly stop, physically, our bodies struggle to cope, but also mentally and emotionally, or even spiritually, we're just at a complete loss.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the idea of what happens next is how do we reframe that next chapter of our lives in a way that's more meaningful. I'm really interested in exploring that, and I think you're right. That sort of idyllic interpretation of how we want to live our lives as rest just doesn't work for our overall well-being, does it? So it's important to have a bit more of a sort of nuanced conversation around it. However,
so many more things I want to do as well.
Yeah. What else is on the list that a change might allow me more time to do, but I still want to do?
Chris,
now, it's not easy.
Chris, he changes careers every 5 years. I'm just waiting for the next iteration.
I'm really curious, Hilary, about what's next. That would be, that would be brilliant. Interestingly, Peter, and again, at some point we'll come back to the questions. But at what stage do you know when to make a change? What do you think about, like when you're thinking about, okay, right, I've done that, I'm now moving on. What stage?
I guess, like most people, it's one of two things. Sometimes it's a choice. Yeah. I kind of thought, I'm a bit fed up with it. Have I really got to do the same thing again and again and again? And, I've lost that kind of energy. And sometimes it's a little bit like greatness. Sometimes we have greatness thrust upon us, or sometimes we have change thrust upon us.
Yeah.
One of the examples I often use is when I was working in a big corporate. And I went in one morning to see my boss to order some more business cards. And she said, Peter, you're no longer important enough to have a business card.
Right.
That would kind of change the rest of I thought, I'm not going to stay with this organisation much longer if they don't think I'm important.
Well, clearly, any sense of purpose just from that comment goes sort of not the most sort of perfect comment for a Monday morning, right? You know, it's just sort of.
I mean, we'll talk about the stories that we tell about ourselves and our situation, I'm sure, later on. And of course, there is another side to that story.
Sure.
There is an illustration of choice that perhaps is not chosen.
Yeah.
Change.
Change strikes upon you, and that actually, my experience from the stories we've shared already on What Happens Next is that sometimes that change strikes upon us can be a lot more difficult than if we'd chosen the change and we're taking steps to move forward. But again, we can talk about that a little bit later on. One question I'm curious about is the reality of a lot of the people we're aiming to help in terms of helping them navigate change, from my side financially and from your side redefining that purpose and rewriting the story so they can take that to the next chapter, is they've been doing what they've been doing for a long time. And there's a fear element involved of saying, well, look, I'm not in a bad place. I'm quite comfortable. What's the practical first step when it comes to thinking about change and thinking about how and when to make it?
I think in many ways, I think one of the most obvious ones is boredom.
Yeah.
You know, people have said, I've done the same thing over and over again. I just can't bear to carry on. I need to do something different. Or they find themselves in the wrong job. They find themselves, in a company with a toxic culture, and sometimes people put up with things for a very long time because making a change is difficult.
Yeah.
We have mortgages, we've got families to support. You kind of think, well, if I step out, what happens? The whole thing comes tumbling down.
Yeah, and look, there's always an element of practicality when it comes to making decisions like this, right?
Yeah.
We've got to be practical when it comes to that, but often we find that people are making decisions to not change based on no data, based on just that fear. So actually having clarity of your financial situation or whatever it may be might help you make that positive change, because I'm not as bad. As in a situation where I can't as I thought I was.
Yeah.
Talk to me now, Hilary. I know that you and I love a concept, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong because I pronounce it differently every single time I say it. But ikigai. How do you pronounce it?
Ikigai. Well, I say ikigai, but it's a Japanese concept. So goodness knows how it's supposed to be pronounced. I'm sure it's not.
probably not the way I've said it, but I'm going for it.
Or me. But actually, I'm glad you asked that question, because when we were talking about people's sense of identity and retirement, it struck me. I thought, actually, this is a really important concept. It comes from the Japanese island of Okinawa.
Yeah.
And it was observed that a lot of people living there lived very long lives. Lots of people lived to 100. And so people were curious and to say, well, what have they got? What makes them live that long? And what they discovered is that they all had something that gave them meaning and purpose. So something that got them out of bed in the morning, something that gave them joy in their lives. It could be a hobby, it could be a relationship. Being the age they were probably wasn't going to be work, although it can apply to work as well. But that was the thing that enabled them to age healthily.
Yeah, and it's encapsulated really well, Hilary, in an image, isn't it? It's as. Can you explain the image to me? It's sort of a Venn diagram, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
But not.
This is very familiar because we use this a lot in our retreats. I think somebody in the West has taken the concept and kind of, as we do in the West, made it into a nice little model. But it's 4 overlapping circles.
Yeah.
And the one at the top is, what do you love? So, what are your hobbies? What are the things you keep going back to? The things that bring you joy. The one on the left-hand side is, what are you good at?
Yeah.
So, you can look back at times in your life when you were performing really well, everything was really successful. What was it that you were demonstrating at the time? What strengths were you demonstrating at the time? And then on the opposite side, on the right-hand side, is what does the world need? Which I translate also into what really matters to you. Because sometimes people think when you say, what does the world need? They need to go off and work with a charity or something, which is not what it's about. But, it's about, so, I come across people who are starting businesses selling, yet another energy drink. And you think, does the world need another energy drink? And then at the bottom.
The way that I always think about that, you might have a different opinion on this, and it's something we think about a lot in Savello. How much does what we do add value to people's lives?
Yes.
Is the way that we think about it, and
yes.
how do we improve our business to make sure we do more of that?
Exactly. Have an impact. And then the last circle at the bottom is, how can I get paid? Now, that isn't part of the original concept, but I think it's useful because I think there are a lot of people, sometimes kind of the top 3 circles can be a bit of a fantasy. I'd love to do this. I'm really good at that. I could spend all my time surfing, but actually, there's a reality. So I think that's kind of where the head bit comes in. Other bits are our heart. The how can I get paid is a kind of, okay, the rubber hits the road.
And I suppose you could argue, and this is the interesting thing, that financial well-being is all about making sure you've got enough money to live the life you want.
Yes.
And if you're getting paid to do what you love, you could do it forever.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think also, where the model is really useful is showing you where you may be making trade-offs. So, for example, if you're playing to your strengths, you're doing what you're good at and getting well paid. Say you're an accountant, It's fine. You may not love it, and that's what you recognize. You're not doing something you love. So, outside work, you go off and do, your football refereeing or whatever, it really brings you joy.
Yeah. That's why. Sorry, Peter. Go on.
That segment in the Ikigai circle is really important because we often talk about what can I get paid for in financial terms. But for me, I think it also has the implication that our personal reward isn't just money. It can be personal satisfaction. It can be pride. It can be an achievement. And it took me a long while, for example, after my first career in teaching, because I got so buried down in the stresses and the strains and the pressure and the discipline and whatever, to remember that actually that was the potential to change lives.
100%.
I've met people since then who've come up to me and said what a difference the lessons of my teaching made in their lives. Wow, I mean that's quite some payback.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a million ways that you can, and it's really interesting. So one of the things, there's a podcast by a guy called Paul Dolan, who's the head of happiness, effectively, at the London School of Economics. He's a behavioural scientist. It's called Get Happier, and I've listened to it over the festive period. It's brilliant. And one of the concepts that he talks about that I really love is that concept of how selfish kindness is, right? So, and actually how we shouldn't shy away from the fact that we don't derive personal satisfaction from doing good to others. So, Peter, your teaching had a positive impact on people's lives and you feel great about that. But actually, if we were more open about saying, well, look, we do good things, not only because it does good to the world, but also because it helps us feel better.
Absolutely.
I actually think it opens a bit more of of an interesting conversation. And I agree with you. I mean, yes, we need to make sure we live the lives in a financially responsible way and look at that element of it. But I think you live a pretty shallow life if you're only thinking about the money. That's just not enough to say it's a holistic one. One other concept that I've been thinking about quite a lot, because I'm writing about it at the minute, is the paradox of choice, right? So if you say to somebody you can do anything you want in the next chapter of your life, that feels quite scary, right? So how do we move? I suppose the phrase that comes to mind is, if we can do anything, we're probably doing nothing.
Yeah, I think it's the dilemma is, I'm sure you face it as well. When I'm writing a new cozy murder mystery, I start off with a blank sheet of paper.
I know.
And in a sense, although it won't be where it ends up, it starts the first time I tap a key and something appears on the screen. Yeah. And I think the dangerous thing when we know there's change coming up is we get so frozen that we can't do anything.
Yeah.
And
so how do we get over that?
First step, it's the starting of the journey. Doesn't matter if it's not in the direction that we end up going in, but making the start just starts to prepare our brain, it starts to prepare our emotions, and the brain will then start to work with the challenge. Yeah. And it'll do that almost irrespective of what we're doing, which is why we often get our best ideas in the early hours of the morning, because the brain is churning away when nothing else is coming in.
Okay, so what's the metaphorical tapping of the key when you're trying to rewrite the next chapter of your life?
I think, and to pick up what Peter said about how the brain works, what's really useful is to ask yourself a question.
I really hope you're enjoying the interview so far. But now what I'd like you to do is take action to help you work out what happens next in your life. The easiest way to do that is to do the What Happens Next quiz. It's free to do, takes about 5 minutes, and you can do it while you make a cup of tea and wait for the next part of the interview. You can visit www.whathappensnext.life/quiz. You'll get your results by email immediately. And what the quiz will do is give you an insight into the areas of wellbeing you're doing really well at, but also the areas that you might want to improve. Enjoy the quiz. Let us know what you think. And let's get on with the interview.
So something like, how would I like my life to be different?
Perfect. Love it.
Or even, what's stopping me from getting to where I want to get to in life? And just posing the question. That's it. And just giving your brain time to work on it, because things will start coming to you.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's so interesting.
Sorry. No, well, I think one of the dangers here is that a lot of the self-help gurus, use words like transformation, and reinventing yourself, and that that as you say can feel really scary, and actually I think completely unrealistic. People don't reinvent themselves. You build on what you've already achieved, what you've done, where you've come from, all of that. So one of the things we do in our retreats is to get people to do a timeline, to look, from the time they were born to where they are now. And actually, it's amazing when people look back, they see trends, they see patterns. We encourage people to build on that. So they're not starting from scratch.
Yeah. I think there's an assumption with change that, as you say, it's got to be transformational, when in reality, change is gradual, right?
Very often, yes.
Yeah, yeah. And it's that realization. I think you're right. I think that element of posing yourself the question, but not putting yourself under any pressure to answer it immediately, but just having it there. Yes. We've all had that, and apologies for giving you this early in the morning. That sort of, I'm in the shower and you go like, oh, I've thought about that.
Exactly.
And that element is like sort of, just having it in your sort of subconscious so that you sort of know it's there is a really good one. I
And
suppose.
Chris, sorry, just to add to that, I know in a sense you'd expect me to say this, but I do think it's something that's quite difficult to do on your own
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
you have preconceived ideas, and our brain wants to work with the minimum of effort.
Mm.
So the minimum of effort is it draws into the past and says, what have I experienced before that will be relevant here? So I don't have to waste energy starting again more fundamentally.
Yeah.
And somebody coming from the outside can very often just ask that simple question that gets the brain thinking, oh, okay, I need to look at that from a fresh perspective. I need to tell a different story, if you like, or see an existing story from a different perspective.
I suppose the other interesting thing with that, Peter, and we'll talk about that. Definitely want to have a conversation about getting the right help and finding somebody you can trust to make sure that you do. How important do you think it is to expand your conversations into? Because I'd imagine that if you're MD of a construction firm and you're sort of spending quite a lot of time at work, you're probably not having conversations outside of your social circle because that's probably pretty well established.
Mm.
How could we potentially take a step to just explore different perspectives?
I think you've hit an interesting point there, because very often the people that we talk to, they've talked to lots of people, and I can understand why you might do that.
Yeah.
The trouble is, you talk to 20 people and you get 21.
It's confusing, right?
And 23 ways you might move forward. So, although that is important, I think you need one person, one organization, one method, if you like, that is the way that takes you forward.
Love that.
It won't be the only one, and other ways may get you to the same point, but just commit to one, work with that process and see where it takes you.
Yeah. And how do you work with find somebody you trust to do that?
Well, I think it's a question of chemistry. Trust is the critical thing. And I think that when potentially you have to open up, start talking about things that you may never have talked about or find it difficult to talk about, we experience this a lot when we're working with people, that they've had difficult experiences in the past that they've just buried and told one story about it, which is now affecting the way that, affecting them in lots of different ways. I think this thing about trust and somebody who you feel you can get on with, and who provides a safe space. So, the whole thing about confidentiality, that whatever you open up about and tell is going to stay with that person.
100%. Yeah, I agree with that. Couple of points you raised there, Hilary, that are really interesting. One is about space, and my experience with people who know that they need to think about what happens next are busy. And that busyness often means that they just haven't got the headspace because they're working all day, and then they're sort of they're tired when they get home potentially, and then need to rest, and then the sort of it starts again. How do you create the space to make sure that you can navigate for you personally and for your own well-being what's next?
Chris, I think I would. It does have to be done. I think what I would talk about is what happens when you don't, because what we see a lot, and when you see people in crisis, very often they run around like headless chickens, and I think as human beings, it always feels better to be doing something than nothing, and so very often people jump into something without thinking. We heard a story about somebody who was very senior in a global telecoms company who, for some reason or other, had to leave, didn't know what to do next, bought a drains franchise, and then discovered he knew nothing. He wasn't interested in trains, knew nothing about plumbing, and the business model of the franchise actually also was really detrimental to him, and he became very stressed. Now, that's a very good example of when you don't take space, what can happen.
Yeah.
So I think the taking space is either, we would say this, wouldn't we? Doing something like a retreat, or finding a coach.
Yeah. But not taking large steps of fundamental action that change your entire trajectory immediately, right? Exactly. It might be action, but it might be, dipping a toe in the water as opposed to jumping in with both feet and buying a drains business for some.
Yes, exactly. Yes, the very thought of it.
We've touched on stories a little bit. And I want to explore stories, and it's really interesting. The more I think about stories in my own life, and I love telling stories. I love a good story. But the more I think about stories in my life, the more I realise that the stories I tell aren't true. Right? They're interpretations of an event that actually happened, but I've changed the story a little bit to make it a bit funnier, or I've changed it to, and that could apply to all of the stories we tell in all of our lives, right? We change the stories to serve ourselves and our own narrative. Now, you've got a far greater perspective on stories than I have. So what role does stories play in our lives, and how do we potentially change that narrative in the stories we tell ourselves to serve us better?
They're hugely important. I mean, Hilary will come up with and tell us an example in a moment, I'm sure. But, however far back you go in human history, there are stories.
Yeah.
It's the medium by which we've always tried to make sense of what happens to us, and particularly the things that we don't readily understand. So, that's where the myths and the legends have come from. And we do them as a way of protecting ourselves, I think. So something happens, and we know we've got to talk about that to other people. So we take a kind of snapshot of the event and we create the story around it. And usually, in my experience, what happens is we have a couple of versions of it earlier on. We keep doing subtle changes until we get the reaction that we want from the people that we're telling it to.
That is true. That is.
And then it becomes fit. But the thing is, we're still telling it in that same format 10, 20, 30, 40 years later. Yeah. And you're absolutely right. If somebody helps us go back to that event and look at it through a different lens or from a different person in the story, then we get a different view of it, a broader, richer view of it. I'll just briefly relate to the business card story. And when I challenged myself to look at that from the perspective of my manager, my goodness me, I got a different perspective, and I got a different view of me that I had to take on board, which is what took it to that position.
Interesting. Really interesting.
Hilary has, I think, that particularly one of the stories of somebody that we worked with that illustrates this in a very real, personal way.
Tell us about that, Hilary. What's that story?
Well, I think one of the most striking stories of somebody we've worked with was somebody who came on one of our retreats very stressed and burnt out, very successful. She had been an MD of an agency, now had her own company, had a young family, but was stressed and burnt out. And at the point in the retreat when we talked about, got people to tell their stories, she told us a story about how when she was coming up to her GCSEs, the head teacher took her in to their office and said, look, just want to prepare you. You're not going to do well. You're not academic. You're not going to get good results. You're not really up to this. Well, of course, she didn't take that lying down, went home, started getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to work, and did get the results she wanted. But, decades later, is still getting up at 5 o'clock. And more to the point, still trying to prove herself. And when we got her to retell that story, she said, actually, I don't think they meant to say what I heard them say. And she rewrote the story from the point of view of what that person had intended to say. And that then became her story.
What did she assume they intended to say? Just so I've got an insight into that.
Well, I think they were trying to be helpful because she was dyslexic.
Yeah.
So they weren't trying to do her down. They were just trying to prepare her for a difficult outcome.
Yeah. I think that's interesting, isn't it? And it's that element of redefining change, so it telling the story so it's more helpful with your life. And I suppose the interesting thing is, would she have, if she hadn't put that effort in, would she have achieved what she had with her career? And she may have done, and she may not have done. But was that story serving her now? And clearly not, right?
No, I think that's a really, really good point. And I think if you go, the research has been done on this. If you go into the lives of many very successful CEOs, successful people, you will find there is some traumatic event in their lives. So parent died, parent ill, something happened, and that person reacted to it in such a way that, it kind of spurred them on. That doesn't, obviously we don't want to create those events, but actually people do rise above it. And those difficult experiences do form us, they influence us. And we go out there and want to prove people wrong.
So how do we decide whether a story serves us or not?
Well, I think the point from that story, which by the way we share with that person's permission, having said we keep confidentiality, you have their permission to share it. She still gets up at that early hour of the morning, but the narrative is different. She recognizes that she's doing it now because she wants to, and she wants to do it because the payoff is she gets flexibility later in the day.
Yeah.
If she wants to go and pick up a child from school, she can. She wants to go for a long walk in the country, she can, because getting up early gives her the freedom that she's changed the story.
Yeah, it's rewriting the narrative, isn't it? That's so important. I suppose one of the things that springs to mind while we're having this conversation is how we define success, right? So that element of conversation she's had, like sort of freedom is freedom in the story I tell myself anyway. So freedom is freedom of time. Freedom that allows me to do what I want with my time, and that sometimes comes with a sacrifice of money. Sometimes I'll prefer the time over the money, and I appreciate that every problem that I've got is a first world one, right? So I just putting that out there, and I want to make sure I'm clear that I know I'm lucky in terms of having to make those choices, but the reality is often when people are thinking about change, the part of the big challenge is they've been told that this is what success looks like for so long. And
you're right. Yeah.
So how do we redefine that? Like, because we're not only redefining ourselves and telling ourselves different stories, we might be redefining what success looks like for us, right? And how do we? Where does that start?
But there are a number of ways, because it can be different for different people.
Yeah.
One of the things that we sometimes use is invite people to write their funeral eulogy.
Yeah.
What would you like people saying about you when you've gone and about your life? And so far, I haven't yet heard one say, success was because I spent my life working so that the children could be better.
Yeah.
It's always about relationships. It's always about impact on other people. And it's often not what we think it's going to be. So success, I think, is, what would give you, listening to your eulogy, that sense of, actually, do you know what? Yeah, I'm really happy with that.
Yeah. Sorry, Hilary, go.
I think in the first half of our lives, I think measures of success are defined for us. So, we set out, we want to establish ourselves in a career, find a life partner, ideally find somewhere to live if you can in this country, and then you get all those things, have kids, and you get to that point, and then you think, hang on a minute, I've got all of that. Now what?
Yeah.
And the classic midlife crisis situation, where you've got all of that and you think, actually, that's not what it's about. And I don't know what it's about.
Or you realize you're not going any further in the career life. You're in that dead end, and it's probably another 10, 20, 30, 40 years of that.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because you get the perception from other people who are on the journey that you're successful, but internally you could be thinking, you know what? It's
No.
I need to make change. It's such an interesting one. You mentioned in the story you shared earlier on about burnout, and doing the research. Look, we've known each other for quite a while, and I've got amazing respect for the curiosity of both of you and the questions you ask, and certainly the work you do. But I always do my research on these interviews, and I sort of scoured your website, and a phrase came out that was really interesting. High achievers and the perception, the story they tell themselves that burnout and languishing is normal. What does that mean? How have you experienced that when you've been working with high achievers? And how do we redefine work as something that shouldn't get us to a point where we're languishing?
Well, I think I think one of your questions was some practical tips on this. If you only have to open a newspaper, you're getting all the practical tips you want at the moment. How to eat healthily, having more exercise. We all know that. So why don't we do it? And I think it comes back to the kind of ikigai question. What really matters? Because unless we know what really matters to us, we're not going to make changes in our lives. Whether it's tackling burnout, or if we're languishing, looking at the issues about why we're languishing, why we're not springing out of bed in the morning. I think it's really about what really matters to us, what's important, and how is the stress or the burnout affecting us in terms of our health, family, our job, our performance, all of those things. So, as I say, I think it's very easy to offer practical tips. I'm not sure that's the answer.
Yeah.
There's also something in that about most of us, we want to fit in. And fitting in is listening to other people and their expectations. So, in an environment where people expect us to work long hours, where we're almost stress becomes a badge of honor. It becomes the unofficial award, the kind of the CBE of the business world, doesn't it? I'm incredibly stressed. And it's really hard to stand out against that and challenge the story and say, no, I'm not actually going to buy into that because it's unhealthy.
You know what, Peter? So, I'm still guilty of it now, right? I can hear myself saying it in my own head. When people go, like you're at a business event or you speak to another professional and they go, how you doing? And my immediate reaction, and I think this is conditioning from like sort of 20 odd years, busy.
Yes.
Busy is my, I'm really because you want to be seen as being, now I'm fairly busy. I've got freedom. I've got a bit of freedom of time as well. But why do we assume that that's got to be the answer?
It's a measure of success. It's a measure of success.
Is it though?
Well, I think we think it is. We say, "Oh, I'm really busy." Oh, well, you must be. You must be really successful. Your business must be going really well.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Busy, and the challenge that I've got is I still do it now. Do you know what I mean? Because it's like that conditioning of like sort of. But what story are we telling? Yeah, it's that shorthand to success, isn't it? You're busy, people want your services, and therefore you must be doing well.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
I don't know whether
I think
busy.
that's true. But I mean, there's nothing wrong with being busy if it's
Yeah.
the right sort of busyness and the right level of busyness.
Yeah.
That sounds terribly trite, doesn't it? It's a little bit like stress.
Yeah.
Stress itself is actually quite healthy. Overstressed is not. And it's how you kind of, for yourself, work out what that healthy balance is.
Yeah, I had a really interesting conversation with a client yesterday about that strive for better, that focus on improvement, and actually there's a tension between wanting to live a fairly relaxed life versus the desire to want to do more. And actually, I don't think that tension's unhealthy.
Oh,
I
yeah,
think some.
yes, absolutely.
And it changes in different stages in your life as well. You know,
Yeah.
if you're a young person working with a small family of, small children, stress and busyness is a very, very different concept.
Yeah.
When you're
Yeah.
75 and there's perhaps only one or two of you.
Yeah, true.
There are grandchildren maybe, but it's a different. We have different levels of stress and busyness at different points in our life, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. But that, I suppose, part of the work we're doing around what happens next is to turn around and go, there's not an arbitrary age to turn around and go, right, rest and relaxation is 100% of our time, because actually that's not healthy either, right? You know, it's just,
Absolutely.
yeah. I suppose the work that we're doing now with what happens next is because what we've found at Savello is that the demand for our services, because people do want to make change in their lives, has been increasing over certainly since 2020 and heading into 2024. Primarily because people have seen a different perspective because of the pandemic, and now are thinking about making change in their lives from from a perspective of the way they spend their time. And the idea of what happens next is to help people navigate that, not only with the money, but also in other aspects of their lives. What changes have you seen since the sort of COVID and the pandemic? And it feels like a long way away now, right? You know, it feels like we're sort of back to a new normal. But I also get the impression from speaking to people that actually it's changed their perspective. From your clients and people you've been speaking to, what perspective change have you seen?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, because we often look back at it and think it was a continuum. You know, we had an opportunity particularly during lockdown and COVID, to reassess, do lots of different things. And there are lots of changes that wouldn't have come about if that hadn't taken place. The emphasis on and the acceptance of working from home for one of them. And then we assumed that post-COVID, we would embrace that brave new world, if you like, on the assumption that things would be back to a relative normal. And of course they weren't, because we went straight from COVID into economic issues. And one of the things we've noticed, I think, quite strongly is, although under the government measures, we never have not yet gone into technical recession, many businesses were behaving exactly as if they were in recession.
Yeah.
So they weren't investing in the future. They didn't have the confidence in the future. And therefore they looked down and focused on the detail again for a different reason.
Yeah.
And we're still, I think, not coming out of that, because what businesses and business leaders most want is certainty. And the one thing we haven't got at the moment is certainty.
Yeah. And I think that the a lot of the challenge with that is, even though COVID and lockdowns was one issue, it does feel like we went straight from that into Ukraine, and then high inflation and high interest rates and stuff like that. I do wonder whether that's, I get why people are prudent, but I do wonder why, if we look at 140 years of history, actually economies are cyclical, right? So
Yes.
we're in a position where the optimist in me says that we will get to a sense of stability and normality at some point. I get that for business and business leaders. How about for individuals? How has the last 4 years changed individuals' perceptions of what their future looks like, do you think,
Well,
if anything?
I think there've been huge changes. I think among younger people, there's a real questioning of the kind of norms of work that we take for granted, that our generation take for granted. So
Yeah.
you've had all the great resignations, the quiet quitting, the focus on well-being, focus on mental health. All of that, I think, has come about. It was probably coming before the pandemic. I think it's just accelerated, and I think people really questioning, well, why should I spend extra time at work? So you've got the quiet quitting, the lazy girl work, all these things have come up. At the other end of the spectrum, and you've probably seen some of this, Chris, you've got the over 50s who think, oh, I've got enough money. I'm ducking out. I'm not doing any more work. And then, I'm sure none of your clients have discovered that they haven't had enough money and they've got to go back to work. I think it's produced changes in lots of different ways.
Mhm.
But even with the over 50s who are going back to work, actually it's not completely back to what they were. It's part-time, perhaps doing a job that they enjoy more. So I think potentially it's just given everybody a greater sense of choice.
But what's interesting as well, Hilary, for me, particularly when I'm working with my clients who are 50 and in their 50s and 60s, is I'll give you a perfect example. We've got NHS, a few NHS consultants that we work with, and actually the government changed the rules about pension limits, the lifetime allowance, to make sure that they could. And it was interesting because we assumed that they'd changed that for consultants only, but they changed it across the board, which was probably a little cleaner and a little easier.
Yes.
But actually, I think, yes, there is a direct correlation between intellectual stimulation and well-being. So actually work, whatever that looks like in our lives, is probably a good thing later in our lives. But just imagine the amount of experience the workplace is losing if you stop at 55 or 60. It's just that 30 years of learning or 40 years of learning is just gone.
Yes.
And it's interesting how changing work environments are gonna have an impact in terms of the intellectual capability of what's in them. I think that's really interesting. We're coming to the end of the interview now, but I want to make sure that people know where to find you. So where online can they visit to find out more about the amazing work you do?
Well, our website, which is an obvious place, is
.guru.
Yes, .guru. Nextchapterretreats.guru. But I would also say, actually, just talk to us. If you've been listening to this and there have been various bits of the conversation that you'd have loved to jump in on, get in touch and let's carry on.
Love that. And last question: what have you? Because I always find that particularly over the last couple of years, I'm learning a lot from clients. So I'm in a really privileged position that I get to have some really interesting conversation with clients, and even though they pay my fees, I'm probably learning more from them than I'm delivering in terms of value. So what have you learnt the most from a client you've worked with?
Gosh, that's an interesting question. I mean, as you say, loads. I think that something that I'm often struck by is how people have survived some very difficult situations and difficult things in their lives, how they've overcome them, and just persevered, showed resilience, just kept going, and very often it's been through having a sense of direction, and that's enabled them to keep going.
Yeah. So just learn. How about you, Peter?
A similar thing, I think, just the richness of people's stories, how diverse they are,
Yeah.
the things that they have managed to overcome quite often are jaw-dropping.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. Thank you both for joining me today. I've really enjoyed it as always. Hopefully you have too. You can find this if you missed any of it. You'll be able to find both the clips and the full interview at whathappensnext.life, along with the growing portfolio of interviews we're doing. We've got some amazing guests coming up, and we've already interviewed some amazing guests around subjects like purpose and values, intellectual well-being, financial well-being, physical well-being, community, and loads of other subjects, including, even though it's not part of the What Happens Next model, how to sell your business in the most effective way. So even though we're focusing on subjects around the What Happens Next model, we appreciate that we want to add as much value as we can in the topics that are going to have a direct impact on your life over the next 3 to 5 years. So we're inviting guests on where we feel that there's a need there. But Peter and Hilary, thank you so much for joining us today. Have a lovely day, and I look forward to speaking to you soon.
You too,
Chris.
Okay.
Same to you too.
All right.
Take care. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
I really hope you enjoyed that. And one of the things that we really want you to do is get as much from the What Happens Next project as you can. And we think that one of the big things you're going to get loads from once it's written is the What Happens Next book. Now, that's currently a work in progress. So I'm doing the work to complete the book now. It will be ready in 2025. But what you can do today is join the waiting list. So you're one of the first people to get a copy and get loads of goodies on top. Because if you join the waiting list today, not only will you get access to the book first, you'll also get loads of goodies that we're currently working on in addition to the book, now ready for launch. To join the waiting list, simply visit whathappensnext.life/book, and you'll be the first to know when the book comes out. So I hope you enjoyed this interview with Peter and Hilary. One favour I would ask is we want to continue to build and develop and grow the What Happens Next podcast. The one thing you can help us to do that for free is subscribe to the podcast on your particular podcast subscription service of choice. Have a lovely day, and we'll see you for next week's show.